"Excuse me, ma'am. This section's for invited guests only." The words echoed across the marble lobby, crisp and loud enough for everyone waiting by the bar to hear. The hostess didn't whisper. She wanted people to know someone didn't belong, and that someone, apparently, was Marcia Claiborne. Marcia stopped mid-step. Her heels had just clicked into the grand entrance of the Sylvan Grand, the most exclusive rooftop restaurant in the city. Her name wasn't just on the deal tonight. She was the deal. The $600 million ESG line of credit being celebrated upstairs, signed off by her, crafted by her team, negotiated through 2 exhausting quarters with the Ainsworth family's attorneys, and yet, here she was, being asked if she was in the wrong place. Marcia turned to the hostess calmly. "My name is Marcia Claiborne. I was personally invited by Julia Ainsworth for the event on the rooftop. Claiborne Capital is the lead ESG partner on the Ainsworth deal." The hostess stared, then offered a thin, polite smile, the kind that always came just before the insult. "I understand, but your name isn't on the list. Perhaps you were invited as a guest of someone. You might need to check in through the service floor. Has anyone ever looked at you like you didn't belong in a room you helped build? Tell us where you're watching from." A flicker of tightness crossed Marcia's jaw, but her voice stayed level. "No, I'm not anyone's guest. I'm the funder." The hostess paused. Then, with a quick glance over her shoulder toward the security desk, added, "Would you mind waiting in the downstairs lounge while we verify?" Behind them, 2 women in evening gowns stood with glasses of wine, watching. One of them let out a soft laugh, not unkind, but unmistakably condescending. The other raised her phone and snapped a picture, not of the room, of her. Marcia's eyes met the phone lens squarely, then dropped to the floor for just a breath, just long enough for the photographer to think she'd gotten away with something. She hadn't. Marcia was shown to a booth in the lounge below the rooftop. Dim lighting, velvet seats, the kind of place you stick people you don't want seen, but can't quite remove. A server brought her a glass of sparkling water without asking. She didn't drink it. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened her email. Scanned the message from Julia Ainsworth's executive assistant just 2 days earlier. "Ms. Claiborne, Julia is thrilled to host you this Friday. Rooftop event begins at 7 p.m. sharp, cocktails and dinner to follow. Valet will be ready." She scrolled again. No RSVP requirement, no mention of needing to bring proof of access, no sign that this wasn't exactly what it was, a formal celebration of her money. She looked up. Still no call from anyone. Still no acknowledgement. Upstairs, laughter flowed like champagne. Julia Ainsworth, in a backless satin dress, made the rounds with a practiced smile. Her father stood near the bar talking to investors from Dubai, while the COO toasted a bright and sustainable future with partners who understand legacy. Someone leaned in. "Ms. Claiborne's downstairs." Julia didn't flinch. "She's early," she said, with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "We'll bring her up later." Marcia stared at the darkened lounge wall in front of her. She could feel the weight in her chest. Not rage, not even sadness. Just the familiar, stinging silence of knowing exactly what was happening, and knowing she'd seen it all before. Years ago, it had been in a university boardroom. Then, in a Paris conference hall. Later, at a summit in Geneva, where a junior male analyst had been addressed as Miss Claiborne, because no one could fathom she was the one running the entire fund. She had grown used to it. That didn't mean she accepted it. Her father used to say, "There's power in quiet. It scares people more than yelling ever will." So she stayed quiet. At 8:26 p.m., she stood, straightened the sleeves of her tailored navy suit, walked past the lounge host, past the elevator, past the second woman who'd been smirking earlier. As she approached the valet, her phone vibrated. It was a message from a junior Ainsworth staffer. "Hope to see you tonight. Crazy crowd upstairs." That was it. No apology. No, "Hey, where are you?" No one noticed she wasn't there, because she wasn't meant to be seen. She stepped into her BMW and closed the door gently behind her. Then, in the soft glow of the car's interior, she opened her tablet. Swiped past her inbox, opened Ethos Core, the private governance panel used by 42 global ESG investment banks and firms. There was a single open review, Ainsworth Energy, ESG standing green, clearance pending. She tapped the drop-down menu, scrolled to the bottom, found the section labeled Ethics Violation, Social Discrimination, Class 5. Her finger hovered for half a second. Then she tapped. Status updated, flagged, immediate review initiated. Across town, the Ainsworth family toasted to their expansion into ethical infrastructure with their faces aglow in candlelight. They hadn't noticed her absence. But by the time dessert was served, 5 banks would already receive automated alerts. Ainsworth Energy has been flagged as non-compliant under Clause 12 of the Claiborne Ethics Standard. Credit line review is now active. As the car merged into traffic, Marcia leaned her head against the glass. The city lights blurred like smudges of gold and blue. She closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in focus. They thought they locked her out of the room. They didn't realize she'd built the system the room depended on to exist. The morning after the rooftop dinner, New York City carried on like nothing happened. Taxi horns, coffee carts on street corners, tourists posing at Rockefeller Center as if time itself paused for them. But Marcia Claiborne wasn't paying attention to any of that. She stood in her apartment window, watching the skyline shift through a veil of early sun and steel shadows. Her black coffee sat untouched. Her phone buzzed quietly on the marble counter behind her, again and again, but she didn't reach for it. She was thinking about the room, not the restaurant. The room. The one she'd never really been invited into, even when her name was stamped on every page of the deal. When Marcia was 10, her grandmother used to say, "People don't have to say you don't belong. They'll show you. Watch where they seat you, baby." She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. The rooftop wasn't about food or celebration. It was a silent performance of status, of who stood near the light and who waited in the dark corners. They hadn't forgotten to add her to the guest list. They had chosen not to. That wasn't an oversight. That was a message, a reminder. No matter how many billions her fund moved, no matter how many initiatives she led, she was still a woman they didn't expect to be powerful, let alone respected. And when they no longer needed her, they made sure she felt that. Her tablet pinged on the kitchen island. She walked over and tapped the screen. Ethos Core alert. Class 5 violation flag. Ainsworth Energy status. Escalated. 5 global ESG banks notified. 2 inactive freeze. A quiet breath left her lips. It was beginning. But it wasn't about vengeance. Not for her. It was about clarity. It was about finally holding people accountable in a language they understood. Money, access, and public standing. She wouldn't yell. She wouldn't threaten. She wouldn't go on TV and tell the world what happened. She didn't need to. The system she helped build was already doing the speaking for her. A few blocks away, inside a gleaming office tower draped in brushed gold and minimalist art, Julia Ainsworth was in the middle of a catered debrief with her executive team. Everyone looked pleased, relaxed, hungover on confidence, until the CFO walked in, pale, clutching his phone. "We have a problem," he said flatly. Julia blinked. What kind of problem? He held out the phone. It displayed the ESG dashboard. Ainsworth Energy. Status. Non-compliant Claiborne Clause 12 triggered. Active review. Julia's jaw locked. What the hell is Clause 12? Her communications director looked up from her laptop. That's the ethics standard Claiborne herself co-authored. It's used across Ethos Core. Remember the thing we had to sign during final compliance? Julia waved her hand. Yeah, but that's just protocol. We didn't do anything. The CFO didn't answer. The comms director did. You don't have to do anything dramatic. A Class 5 flag means some form of social discrimination was witnessed and recorded, or evaluated based on pattern. Recorded, Julia snapped. You think someone filmed something? Back in her apartment, Marcia flipped through her morning briefings. The messages were coming in fast now. From inside the ESG ecosystem, Marcia just saw the Ainsworth flag. Bold move. Proud of you. We've been watching that family skirt compliance for years. They thought the rules didn't apply to them. Until now. Let us know if we need to vote on escalation. You'll have the numbers. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just tapped, acknowledged, and moved to her next file. Ainsworth wasn't just her battle. They represented every deal that weaponized silence and politeness to avoid accountability. Every handshake that turned cold when it was no longer useful. Every meeting where the thank you came but never the seat at the table. She wasn't going to change that by raising her voice. She was going to drain the room of oxygen. At 9:44 a.m., her assistant buzzed in. Board wants to know if you're still attending the Impact Summit next week in Geneva. Marcia didn't look up. Yes, she said, and moved my keynote up to first slot. Pause. I want to open the summit. 2 hours later, Julia sat in a glass-walled conference room, breathing hard. 3 calls, 5 emails, all unanswered. Her father, old-school oil baron turned corporate chair, was now looped in. "This woman is blowing things out of proportion," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll call her directly." The CFO looked horrified. "That's inadvisable. She just triggered a global freeze across 3 banks. A direct call could be considered pressure." The room fell silent. Julia stared at her untouched espresso, cold now. "This is insane," she whispered. "We invited her. She didn't even ask to be seated with us." "She didn't have to," the COO murmured. "She funds the room." Julia's chest tightened. This wasn't just going to blow over, and they both knew it. At noon, Marcia sat in her private office on the 28th floor of the Claiborne Capitol building. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in muted light. No noise, no chaos, only clarity. Her phone buzzed once more. Caller ID, Ainsworth Holdings. She stared at the screen. Didn't move. Let it ring out. Then deleted the call log. Some silences were louder than any statement she could make. Outside, the city continued as usual. But inside, something had shifted. The woman they tried to keep out of the room? She had just pulled the thread holding the whole room together, and she wasn't done. Not even close. Marcia Claiborne stood in front of the elevator doors of her office building, arms crossed, waiting. She could hear the low hum of conversations down the hall. Her staff was buzzing. The finance world was on fire. But inside her, everything was still. Calm, sharp, cold even. Like the quiet part of a storm where decisions are made. The night before had done something to her. Not just the public humiliation. She'd faced worse in her career. What had shaken her wasn't that it happened, but that she'd almost expected it. Like her body already knew the script. And that was the real damage, wasn't it? You get so used to being pushed to the side, you almost stop noticing. Until you decide not to anymore. By the time the elevator dinged open, Marcia had already scanned through the incoming notifications. 3 ESG fund managers requesting clarification on the Class 5 flag. 2 European pension funds requesting a formal statement before reallocating capital. Northstone Investment Group halting future commitments with Ainsworth until further notice. She stepped inside the glass-walled elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor. As the city dropped beneath her, her reflection looked back. Tired, yes, but unshaken. This wasn't about one insult at a fancy dinner. This was about years of walking into rooms she had built and being treated like the help. In her office, she poured a small glass of cold water, sat in the leather chair that overlooked Manhattan, and opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photos, folded news clippings, a yellowed article from the Wall Street Herald, 1998. First black female advisor joins Geneva Trust's Global Commodities team. No picture, no interview, just a footnote. At the time, she'd kept it like a trophy. Now, she saw it for what it was, a record of being barely acknowledged. She took a breath, then pulled out the last photo in the stack, an image of her father, standing beside a dusty workbench in a garage in Atlanta. his arm resting on a rusted vice grip. He used to fix old engines for a living. Told her once, "Nothing works without pressure, baby. You just have to decide where to apply it." She smiled softly. Then she got to work. Across the river at Ainsworth Holdings, things were unraveling. The crisis was no longer internal. Major outlets were now circling. Bloomberg, CNBC, and the Financial Times all wanted quotes. The most damning? A leaked memo from a regional compliance officer. Based on internal reporting, the behavior toward Ms. Claiborne may constitute a breach of Clause 12 under the Claiborne Ethics Standard. Clause 12. Her clause. In a desperate move, Julia Ainsworth tried to release a public statement. "Ms. Claiborne is a respected professional and longtime partner. We regret any misunderstanding." It was short, sterile, and, most importantly, empty. The backlash was immediate. One response on social media, now retweeted 200,000 times, read, "You don't misunderstand how to treat the woman funding your future." Another added, "She didn't ask for a seat at your table. She pulled the plug on your lights." Marcia didn't post anything. She didn't need to. The narrative was no longer hers to push. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt what she felt. She simply watched, quietly, and then she forwarded the Ainsworth press release to her general counsel. "File this under performative response. No action needed. Keep recording." That afternoon, her assistant knocked gently on the glass door. "Ms. Claiborne, the students from Columbia are here for the leadership roundtable." Marcia nodded. "Send them in." A dozen young faces walked in. Black, brown, white, male, female, queer, immigrant, all bright-eyed and eager. These weren't legacy kids. These were fighters, people who'd clawed their way through school, internships, and interviews where their names were mispronounced and their presence mistaken for tokenism. Marcia welcomed them like family. She didn't talk about Ainsworth. She didn't need to. But one student, a girl with short twists and a firm voice, finally asked what everyone was thinking. "Ms. Claiborne, what do you do when you know they're only inviting you for your signature but not your seat?" Marcia looked around the room, then answered, "You sign it, but you write the rules in ink so permanent that the next time they try to erase you, they have to burn down the building." The room fell still. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. They understood. They were building toward that same moment. After they left, Marcia sat alone in the fading afternoon light. She thought about her first internship in a government building where no one looked like her. She thought about being asked to bring coffee while carrying an MBA in her bag. She thought about being called Miss Marcia by people who damn well knew her name. And she thought about how she had always swallowed those moments. Not anymore. At 5:17 p.m., she received a flagged alert. Ainsworth removed from ESG Preferred Index by 3 rating agencies. Estimated market impact, 1.8 B, over 48 hours. She stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds. Then she turned it off. Some victories don't need confetti, just quiet, deliberate correction. The next morning, Julia stood in the Hartley Plaza Conference Center, her world visibly shrinking. 2 major banks had pulled future project funding. Her father was facing calls to step down, and everywhere she turned, she saw it. Not hatred, not anger, just the cold, quiet weight of loss. Loss of trust, loss of influence, loss of immunity. She sat down, her phone still in her hand, staring at an unanswered email she'd sent Marcia the night before. No response. Just one word below her signature, seen. That night, as Marcia walked through the lobby of her apartment building, the doorman nodded respectfully. "Ms. Claiborne, quite the news today." She gave a small smile. "Is that so?" He grinned. "Everyone's saying you made Wall Street blink." Marcia paused, then said softly, "Let them blink. They weren't seeing clearly anyway." She rode the elevator up to the penthouse, walked into her home, took off her shoes, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a full breath. Not shallow, not forced. A real one. Because for once, She hadn't just walked out of the room. She had walked through it, and this time it was the world outside that had to catch up. Julia Ainsworth hadn't slept. Not a minute. The night bled into the morning, and by 6:47 a.m., she was standing barefoot in her oversized kitchen, staring blankly at the glass doors that overlooked her family's private garden. There were 6 missed calls from her father, 4 from the board. Her PR team had sent 3 drafts of a public statement, none of which she approved, because none of them could undo what happened. Marcia Claiborne hadn't gone to the press. She hadn't made a scene. She hadn't even spoken. And that's exactly what made it terrifying. Julia opened her phone and scrolled to her portfolio dashboard. The red numbers looked like blood across her screen. Ainsworth Energy, ANE, down 19.7%. ESG index removal, confirmed. Pending credit review, 5 banks. Estimated market cap loss, 1.8 billion in under 36 hours. One of the quants had called it a controlled implosion. Julia called it something else. Payback, served with the kind of precision she never saw coming. At exactly 8 o'clock a.m., Marcia Claiborne stepped into the sleek glass conference room at Claiborne Capital's Manhattan headquarters. She was dressed in a dark charcoal suit with no jewelry, just a silver pen clipped to the inside pocket of her blazer. Her legal team was already seated. So was her chief risk officer, the director of governance, and a compliance auditor from Ethos Core. The room smelled like fresh coffee and something colder, something institutional, like sterilized steel. "Let's begin," Marcia said, voice low and clear. Across the conference table, her general counsel pulled up a secure slide. Case file. Ainsworth Energy Toa. Ethics Clause 12, Flag. Violation type, social discrimination. Origin, internal observation and incident pattern. Triggered by Claiborne. Response, Class 5 flag, escalated. Next slide. Immediate consequences. £600 in ESG credit line, frozen. Ainsworth removed from 3 global green indices. 42 financial institutions notified via Ethos Core. Public Trust Index, sharp decline. Next slide. Recommendations, sustain the freeze. Expand internal ESG ethics training requirement to all future deals. Establish precedent for silent clause enforcement. Marcia tapped her pen once against the table. Document everything, she said. No press, no commentary. Let the institutions decide how loudly they want to talk about ethics. Her staff nodded. There was no drama, just due process, designed by Marcia herself. At 9:12 a.m., Julia entered the Ainsworth Tower conference room where her father, Chairman Richard Ainsworth, sat at the head of the table. His face looked carved from granite. He didn't rise, didn't even speak. He just slid a printout across the table. It was an email. Subject, partnership suspension. Effective immediately from North Star Pension Fund. She skimmed it quickly. Due to current ethics compliance status, we are unable to continue holding equity or debt positions associated with Ainsworth Energy or its related holdings. Attached was a transaction confirmation. 143M divested. Julia gripped the table's edge. This can't be happening, she muttered. Her father's voice was low, even. This is happening. Because of your pride. I didn't say anything to her. No, he said. You didn't have to. Back in Midtown, Marcia sat alone in her office for the first time all morning. The door was closed. Phone muted. She took off her heels and curled her feet under her chair, sipping water from a glass tumbler. In front of her lay a short email from a partner at Sterling Global. Marcia, I don't know how you stayed so composed. I don't know how you didn't burn it all down. But whatever this is, whatever you just did, it's what this industry has needed for 30 years. Proud to stand behind you. Sam, she closed her laptop. Not everything had to be answered. Not every hand had to be shaken. That evening, headlines blared across major outlets. Ainsworth Energy loses 1.8 billion in 36 hours after silent ESG freeze. The woman who redefined corporate retaliation, Marcia Claiborne in Clause 12. No interview, no comment, just consequences. Social media lit up. Dignity is policy, had Claiborne. Standard, had she didn't speak. One tweet read, "You ever get so powerful you don't even clap back? You just remove access." In a quiet corner of the city, Marcia stood at the back of a small bookshop where her goddaughter's poetry group was doing an open mic night. She wore jeans, a simple black blouse. No one there knew who she was. She listened, smiled, clapped politely, and when someone offered her the mic for closing words, she waved it away. She didn't need a spotlight tonight. She'd already turned it off in all the right places. At 11:58 p.m., Julia stood in her private office with the lights dimmed. She opened her email again. The original invite she sent to Marcia before the dinner. She read it slowly. "Looking forward to celebrating the partnership, Marcia. Your leadership has been invaluable. See you on Friday." Then she opened the photo a colleague had taken of the rooftop that night. In the background, a table of 12 people laughing. In the foreground, one empty chair. She stared at it, stared, and stared. And for the first time, she realized it hadn't just been a missed seating. It had been a message. But not from her, from Marcia. The message had been, "You don't get to decide where I sit anymore, because I'm no longer at your table. I'm building the room." And now, she was the one outside the room, knocking, but no one was opening the door. The morning after the freeze, something shifted in the city, not in sound or weather, but in posture. Meetings started late. Analysts reran their models. Traders stopped mid-sentence, checking alerts. At every level of the market, people asked the same quiet question: who really controls access now? At 7:03 a.m., the Ethos Core dashboard lit up. Claiborne Clause 12 enforcement, Ainsworth Energy, flagged, non-compliant. Credit integrity tier, suspended, ESG. Eligibility, revoked, ethics compliance. Score, 38,100, down from 91. Institutional confidence, under review, triggered by M. Claiborne. The system automatically rerouted notifications to 11 clearinghouses, 7 pension funds, and 4 sovereign wealth advisors. No announcement, no press release, just cold precision. Within minutes, ripple effects began. By 9:15 a.m., the CEO of Sterling National Bank called his risk committee into an emergency session. "Marcia didn't just freeze one company," he said. "She sent a compliance benchmark to the entire industry." One board member asked, "What if she does it again?" No one answered, because everyone knew she could, and worse, she had every right to. Across the country, 3 asset managers began quietly reviewing their portfolios, flagging companies whose internal ESG reports hadn't been audited in over a year. By lunch, 2 corporate boards called unscheduled closed-door sessions to discuss their own ethics vulnerabilities. It wasn't fear, it was alignment. The message was clear. Conduct was now currency, and Marcia Claiborne held the pen. That same afternoon, in a glassy high-rise in London, a partner at Eastgate Capital scrolled through the headlines while waiting for espresso. He paused, then smirked. "She did it," he said under his breath. "The Claiborne Standard is live." His assistant looked over. "You mean the framework she pitched at Davos?" He nodded. "The one everyone laughed at." They're not laughing now. Back in New York, Marcia sat in her office reviewing a briefing on water equity infrastructure. Her calendar hadn't changed. She hadn't issued a statement. She hadn't spoken to the media. She didn't need to. She had something far more powerful: credibility. Her silence wasn't absence, it was authority. Around 3:30 p.m., her chief of staff entered with a stack of sealed letters. Some formal apologies, others cautious offers for ethics partnership reviews. Marcia didn't look up. "Flag them for Q3, she said. "We don't need to respond yet." The room fell quiet. She wasn't chasing meetings anymore. They were chasing her. Meanwhile, at Ainsworth HQ, silence took a different shape. Julia Ainsworth sat in a room full of lawyers, advisors, and public relations teams. No one had a real answer. "She didn't sue us," one advisor murmured. "She didn't leak anything. She just removed our ethical clearance," another added. Julia looked at her father. Richard Ainsworth's face was drawn and damp with sweat. "How do we fix this?" she asked. He didn't answer, because he knew. You don't negotiate with a system you no longer control, especially not when the system now runs through the woman you once publicly humiliated. That night, at a private investor gathering in Tribeca, Marcia arrived alone. No announcements, no flashy introductions, no entourage, just presence. People turned. Chairs shifted. A few even stood. Even the room knew. A new power had entered, not loud, not angry, but absolute. And the industry finally understood. This wasn't revenge. It was realignment. One call hadn't just frozen a deal. It had shifted the standard. And Marcia Claiborne hadn't said a single word. She didn't need to. The system spoke for her. It was a Tuesday. Rain tapped gently on the windows of Claiborne Capital's 33rd floor. The kind of rain that muted the city's noise, slowed its pace, and made everything feel like it was pausing, just long enough for decisions to settle. Marcia sat at the head of the boardroom, reviewing the agenda for the afternoon. Her executive assistant leaned in quietly. "They've arrived, all of them." Marcia nodded without looking up. "Bring them in." One by one, they entered. 12 men and women in tailored suits, all with titles that meant influence. Managing directors, board chairs, capital partners, risk officers. But this wasn't a summit. It was a test, because none of them were used to coming into a room like this and being the ones under review. Julia Ainsworth was last to enter. She wore navy, no makeup, her hair pulled back. Gone was the sharpness, the curated confidence she always carried like armor. She didn't speak, didn't smile. And when her eyes met Marcia's, there was no hint of defiance, only recognition. "You hold the room now." Marcia didn't rush. She let silence settle like fog. Then she stood and walked slowly toward the window, speaking without turning. "Ethics," she said. "It's funny how nobody wants to talk about it until it's the only thing that matters." No one moved. She continued, her voice calm. "What happened last week wasn't personal, but it was illustrative." Now she turned. "I didn't remove Ainsworth Energy from the system. I just told the truth loud enough for the system to hear itself." An older man in a gray suit cleared his throat. "Marcia, Miss Claiborne, we're not here to defend anyone's behavior, but we'd like to propose a restoration plan. One that—" "Stop," she said, her tone cutting through like glass. "I don't want a plan. I want a precedent." That word hung in the air. She let it breathe. A plan helps one company. A precedent changes the next 100. Then she walked back to the table. "And I don't care who's embarrassed. I care who's aligned." Julia finally spoke, her voice lower than usual. "We were wrong." She didn't elaborate, didn't deflect, didn't defend. "We were wrong," she said again, more clearly this time. "And we'll follow any structure you put in place." Marcia studied her for a long beat, then picked up a folder and slid it across the table. Inside, a printed copy of the Claiborne ESG Ethics Charter, including a new clause called the Reciprocity Mandate. It was bold. It required participating firms not only to undergo review, but to host review panels for others, rotating quarterly, to take public stances, to disclose training, internal penalties, and anonymized conduct logs. "This isn't a policy," Marcia said flatly. "It's a filter." One of the women at the far end blinked. "A filter for what?" Marcia smiled, just slightly. "For whether you belong in the next economy." Across Manhattan, whispers had already started. Analysts called it the Claiborne Wall. Funds speculated on which companies would clear it. Journalists begged for interviews. Marcia declined them all, because this wasn't about exposure. It was about ecosystem design. Back in the room, one of the execs from a major ESG fund finally spoke. "If we sign this, we're on the hook for others too." Marcia nodded. "That's the point. But what if they fail the audit?" Marcia leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Then you decide whether ethics is still worth defending, when it's no longer convenient. For a moment, no one responded. Then Julia did something no one expected. She stood and signed. No theatrics, no eye contact, just pen to paper. The sound echoed in the silence. One by one, others followed. By the end of the hour, 10 out of 12 had signed. 2 asked for time to review. They wouldn't be invited back. As the last of them left, Marcia stayed seated. She looked at the signatures on the page, not for pride, but for structure. She was building something, not a network, not a brand, a standard. Later that evening, she sat in her Harlem brownstone, slippers on, jazz playing faintly from the kitchen speaker. Her niece, Tasha, was doing homework at the dining table. "Can I ask you something?" Tasha said, not looking up from her laptop. "Sure," Marcia replied. "Did you win?" Marcia paused, thinking, then leaned back, smiling softly. "I didn't win," she said. "I just changed what counts as losing." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the city was still quiet, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because when a woman like Marcia Claiborne resets the rules, not with noise, but with integrity, the smart ones don't protest. They listen, they adjust, they find their place in the room, or they leave it. The first international call came at 2:12 a.m. Marcia was asleep, but her phone, set only to ring for 4 names, buzzed softly beside her. It was Elena Joubert, Chief Ethics Officer of the European Infrastructure Union. She didn't bother with greetings. "It's happening," Elena said in her crisp French accent. "We're moving forward. You'll have the full vote by Friday." By sunrise, 6 other calls had come in. Singapore, Berlin, Nairobi, Toronto, Sao Paulo, Zurich, each with the same message. "We're adopting the Claiborne Reciprocity mandate as baseline." What started as a quiet freeze in New York was now gaining momentum like a weather system, building over water, reaching across oceans. At 9 a.m. sharp, Marcia stood in front of the windows of her office, watching the Hudson. She wasn't smiling. She was calculating. "Get me the updated compliance map," she said to her assistant. Within minutes, a visual lit up the conference screen behind her. 42 firms, 7 countries, 3 federal bodies, all on board or requesting onboarding into the Claiborne standard. But the moment that solidified everything wasn't a press release. It was a private email from an unlikely name. Kenji Tanaka, chairman of Hoshida Capital, Japan's second-largest private fund. Subject, "For your eyes only." Message, "Our board voted. Ethics is no longer a nice-to-have. It is now a precondition. Your framework passed 11-1. We will announce at midnight Tokyo time, quietly but decisively." Marcia read it twice, then closed her laptop. At noon, she met with her global strategy team. No fanfare, no camera crews, just black coffee, rolled up sleeves, and maps pinned with push pins. They weren't talking about if anymore. They were talking about how fast. "Phase 1 is done," Marcia said. "Now comes Phase 2, certification and enforcement." "What's the risk?" asked Jerome, her risk officer. "That they pretend to play along," she replied. Meanwhile, at a private equity summit in Geneva, whispers swirled. A prominent fund manager leaned into a conversation over cocktails. "You hear about Claiborne's framework? They say 3 trillion in assets might go through it within a year," someone muttered. "Insane." "No. Inevitable." A pause. Then the real question. How do we get on her whitelist? By 3 p.m., 5 American companies submitted pre-audit requests. One of them, a global conglomerate that had once publicly dismissed ESG as a media fad. Now, they were sending handwritten letters to Marcia's office on heavyweight stationery. One CEO even included a PS. "We regret the prior public statement. We now recognize the gravity of leadership ethics." That evening, Marcia walked into a quiet midtown hotel lounge. Waiting for her was Dr. Evelyn Aluko, the Nigerian economic reformer turned UN ethics chair. She rose with a soft smile. "I've been watching," she said. Marcia nodded. "So I've heard. They sat. Dr. Aluko placed a folder between them. Inside, a proposal for an international alignment framework between Claiborne's U.S. Charter and the UN's developing Civil Conduct Compact. "I'd like you to be our cornerstone partner," Aluko said. Marcia studied the document. "What's your angle?" "Legacy," Evelyn replied. "Yours, not mine." Back at Claiborne HQ, the news ticker outside the building had changed. It no longer read, "Markets respond to ESG freeze." Now it pulsed with, "Claiborne Standard goes global. 19 governments reviewing compliance." Marcia didn't smile when she saw it. She closed the blinds. Meanwhile, Julia Ainsworth was in Dubai, halfway around the world, half a world away from her former power. A local journalist tried to interview her at a tech summit. "We understand you were part of the Claiborne freeze situation." She stopped him mid-sentence. "I wasn't part of it," she said. "I was the lesson." That night, Marcia sat at her kitchen table. A single candle, a pot of peppermint tea. She read a letter from a small business owner in South Africa. "Because of your standard, my supplier fired their corrupt auditor. I can finally compete fairly. I just wanted to say thank you. You changed my life, and you don't even know me." She folded the letter and put it in a wooden box she kept near the fridge. The lid read, "Real value." At 11:45 p.m., her phone buzzed one last time. This time, it was someone unexpected. Lucas Reinhardt, CEO of Veritas Core International, one of the world's most conservative asset groups. His voice was clipped but deliberate. "We've reconsidered," he said. "Reconsidered what?" Marcia asked. "Everything." By the end of the week, the numbers were staggering. $2.7 trillion in assets voluntarily pledged for Claiborne audits. 19 countries adopting reciprocity clauses as part of ethics trade policy. 76 CEOs requesting advisory sessions with her firm. And one confidential offer from a U.S. federal ethics agency to collaborate on national enforcement models. Marcia didn't brag, didn't tweet, didn't post selfies in conference halls. Instead, she went home early on Friday, lit a candle, read a book on coral reef resilience, and called her niece Tasha just to ask how school went. Because when you're busy resetting the world, you still make time for what anchors you. By now, everyone wanted in. Or at least, they wanted it to look like they were in. That was the problem. It started with a glossy, full-page ad in the Wall Street Global. The headline screamed, "Ainsworth Group fully compliant with the Claiborne Standard, building ethical futures together." Marcia read it at her desk, then reread it. Her face remained still, but her hand curled slightly on the page. Because she hadn't certified them. Not yet. An hour later, her compliance lead burst into the room. "3 companies are now claiming alignment. None of them passed audit," she said breathlessly. "They're trying to game the system." Marcia didn't flinch. She just asked one question. Are they faking compliance or just faking the branding? Over the next 2 days, the charade unfolded like clockwork. Firms posting ethics charters they never implemented. Executives putting Claiborne aligned on their LinkedIn. One CEO even quoted Marcia in a keynote, a quote she never said. A new form of power was being mimicked. And with mimicry comes manipulation. At first, Marcia stayed quiet. She didn't chase headlines. She watched. She gathered evidence. Until the morning of the Ethics Exchange Forum, an annual closed-door summit for institutional investors. Marcia walked into the main ballroom, wearing charcoal gray. No fanfare, no cameras, just a USB drive in her coat pocket. The room was filled with polished smiles and hollow nods. She took her seat quietly. Then, when it was her turn to speak, she walked to the podium, placed the USB into the laptop, and loaded a presentation titled, Appearance Alignment. Slide 1. A list of 12 companies claiming public compliance. Slide 2. Internal audits showing falsified reports, missing documentation, and one email chain where a CFO wrote, "Just slap her name on the policy doc. No one checks." The room froze. Marcia didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply narrated. "This isn't about me. It's about math. You can't fake structure, and you can't hide from consequence. A pause. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice razor sharp. Starting today, any firm misrepresenting compliance will be placed on the shadow list, a public ledger of deceptive actors. Their ESG access? Frozen. Investor rating? Flagged. Access to ethics forums? Revoked. It landed like a bomb. No shouting, no debate, just deep, anxious silence. A few CEOs shifted in their chairs. One quietly slipped his phone out under the table. He was likely texting legal. After the session, Marcia didn't linger. She returned to her office where her team had already received 12 urgent clarification emails and 3 meeting requests labeled confidential. She responded to none of them because she knew something they didn't. Power isn't proven by who copies you. It's proven by who changes because of you. That evening, a trusted ally came to visit. Ezra Kim, head of a major ESG ratings agency and longtime friend. He walked in holding a manila folder and a bottle of red wine. "You'll want to see this first," he said, handing her the folder. Inside were screenshots, audit notes, and a transcript. It showed that one of the largest compliance firms in Europe had created fake Claiborne certifications for a fee. 3 clients, all verified. Ezra leaned back. "So what do we do?" Marcia didn't blink. "We don't do anything. We expose." The next morning, Claiborne Capital launched a new tool on their ethics portal. The Integrity Index, real-time compliance verification. Every verified firm now had a scannable code linked to their audit report, date-stamped and unalterable. And every fake one? Left blank. A void that said everything. News outlets called it the Claiborne crackdown. But Marcia wasn't cracking down. She was drawing the line. 2 days later, Julia Ainsworth called. Not her assistant. Not her lawyer. Julia herself. "I deserve to speak to you," she said. "We've taken real steps. You took an ad out," Marcia replied flatly. "That's not a step. That's a stunt." Silence on the line. Julia softened her voice. "We'll do the audit. Fully. Publicly." Marcia didn't reply immediately. Then, "Good. But know this. If you fail again, it won't be quiet this time." And with that, she hung up. By the end of the week, 37 companies had removed Claiborne Aligned from their websites. 6 issued formal apologies. 1 changed its board chair entirely. Because now it wasn't just about getting on the list. It was about staying off the shadow list. That Sunday, Marcia finally exhaled. She sat alone in her garden, sipping jasmine tea. Tasha came out with a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. "You okay?" the teen asked. Marcia nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" She stared out at the early dusk. That moment, when people stop faking change and start fearing what happens if they don't. Tasha looked up, serious. "Is that good or bad?" Marcia smiled softly. "It's progress." The moment she read the email, Marcia didn't blink. She simply stared at the screen for a long, silent beat. The subject line was simple. "You should know this." The sender? Anonymous. But the contents weren't. Attached were 3 things. A private chat log between Ethan Reese, one of her senior data analysts, and a compliance officer from Bexton Financial. A Venmo transaction to 9750 labeled consulting. A PDF audit report, identical to the one Claiborne Ethics had released. Except this one had Bexton listed as certified, though they had failed 3 critical criteria. Marcia stood up from her desk. Not fast, not with anger, just deliberately. She walked to the window, looking out at the late afternoon skyline. Her voice, when it came, was low. "Get me Jerome, now." Within 15 minutes, her internal audit lead sat across from her, visibly tense. "Pull every communications log Ethan's touched in the past 90 days, she said. "External and internal." Jerome nodded. "Should I bring this to legal?" "Not yet," she replied. "First, I need to know the truth, not just the breach." By midnight, the story unfolded like a cracked pane of glass, branching in all directions. Ethan had been approached quietly. They didn't offer him millions. They didn't need to. They offered him a seat at a table he thought he'd never be invited to, an advisory role with Bexton's new Ethics Future Division, a fancy title, a hefty bonus, and the unspoken promise of being seen. In exchange, he'd slip them early copies of rejection reports and adjust phrasing on 2 verdicts before they became final. Marcia didn't sleep that night. She sat in her kitchen, a single light on, hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee she never drank. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed, which, for someone like her, was worse. Because Ethan wasn't just a name on payroll. He'd been in the room when they built the very protocol Bexton tried to bypass. He'd been trusted with truth. The next morning, she walked into the office early, earlier than her assistant, earlier than Jerome. She didn't take the elevator. She climbed the stairs. Every step, a decision. At 7:43 a.m., Ethan arrived, coffee in hand, oblivious, until he saw her waiting at the far end of the conference room. He froze. "Marcia," he started. She didn't raise her voice. "Sit down." The conversation wasn't long. She didn't ask if he did it. She showed him the screenshots, the transcript, the payment log. And then she asked one question. "Why?" Ethan's voice cracked before it even reached full volume. I thought I was being left behind. Everyone else was being elevated. I wanted something." "A shortcut," Marcia said quietly. "No, a seat at the table." "You were already at the table, Ethan," she replied, her voice soft but devastating. "You just couldn't see it." She didn't fire him, not yet. She gave him a choice. "You can resign today, quietly, or you can stay, face the ethics committee, and let the process speak for itself." Ethan's shoulders dropped. He chose the second. He said he wanted to own it. Marcia just nodded. But deep down, she wasn't sure if that meant redemption or just image management. Later that afternoon, Jerome approached her quietly. "We found 2 more analysts who received similar offers." She closed her eyes for a long second. Then, "How far does it go?" "Hard to say, but Bexton's not acting alone." By the end of the day, Claiborne Ethics had flagged 5 firms for possible coordinated manipulation of the compliance network. The headlines hadn't broken yet, but the storm had already begun. That evening, Marcia sat down with her external counsel, a no-nonsense woman named Petra Wallace. "You know what they're doing, right?" Petra said bluntly. "They couldn't destroy your system from the outside, so now they're trying to rot it from within." "And they're betting I'll stay silent," Marcia replied. "Will you?" Marcia stared at her for a long moment. Then, "No, but I won't scream either. I'll let the proof do the damage." At 8:15 p.m., Claiborne Capital quietly released a statement of concern on their website. No names, no theatrics. Just a single-page memo outlining a new internal firewall and real-time anomaly tracking. By midnight, 5 CEOs had called to ask, "Are we implicated?" Marcia answered none of them directly, because she knew something they didn't. The ones who panic first usually have something to hide. But privately, Marcia wrestled with something deeper than betrayal. She questioned if the vision itself, of a world governed by ethics and transparency, was too idealistic to survive real human ambition. That night, she called Evelyn Aluko. "I need to ask something," Marcia said. "Shoot." "How do you know when a movement becomes an institution?" Evelyn didn't pause. "When it survives sabotage and keeps going anyway." The next morning, her inbox had something unexpected. A whistleblower file from inside Bexton. Dozens of emails, chats, even a voice memo. One line stood out, a directive from a Bexton executive. "Slow her down. Undermine from within. She won't see it coming." Marcia smiled, not from satisfaction, but from clarity. She turned to her assistant. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow. We're going to DC." "DC? Why?" "Because if they want to play dirty, I'll play federal." The jet touched down in DC under slate gray skies. Marcia didn't check into a hotel. She went straight to the Eisenhower building. Her team had arranged a private session with 4 federal ethics commissioners, plus a quiet observer from the SEC. No media, no leaks, just truth, and the kind of silence that makes men sweat. By the time she walked into the private chamber, everything had changed. The whistleblower file was now a classified dossier. The 5 firms involved had been cross-referenced with pending federal contracts. And the compliance sabotage? It wasn't just unethical. It was fraud against federally audited investment pathways. That made it criminal. She stood at the center of the long, oval table. No notes, no laptop. Only the room's tension. Then she began. Let me be clear, I'm not here to retaliate. I'm here to ensure that the system we built to protect investors, employees, and future generations isn't turned into a marketing gimmick by the very people who lobbied against ethics. She paused, letting it settle. They couldn't stop it from the outside, so now they're planning rot within. Commissioner Dean, silver-haired, former DOJ, leaned forward. Are you proposing we federalize your index? No, Marcia said, calm. I'm proposing you recognize it as a minimum ethics standard for federal contractors. Silence. Then Commissioner Patel spoke. If what you're alleging is true, Claiborne's framework is the only system right now with enough teeth to catch this kind of misconduct. Marcia nodded once, and enough spine to report it. What followed was 43 minutes of negotiation, not shouting. Strategy. By the end of the meeting, a quiet agreement was reached. The Claiborne Ethics Index would be integrated as a pilot ethics benchmark across 3 federal contract sectors. Any manipulation of this index would now trigger a joint SEC and DOJ investigation. A cross-agency ethics board, including Marcia as a founding non-govy seat, would be formed within 90 days. When she stepped out of the building, no cameras waited, no headlines screamed, but something far louder had just been written. A new rule book, and she co-authored it. Back at her office in New York the next morning, her assistant greeted her with an alert. 3 firms on the shadow list just lost their municipal investment clearances. Marcia barely reacted. She simply said, have Jerome pull their backup filings. Let's make sure they didn't reroute through Europe. Because she knew something the public didn't. When you cut the head off a shadow network, the limbs look for foreign havens. That afternoon, a different kind of email landed in her inbox. Subject line, request for dialogue. Sender, Lawrence Bexton. No assistant, no PR team, just him. The email read, Ms. Claiborne, we'd prefer to resolve this outside of formal inquiry. I believe we both understand that prolonged exposure isn't beneficial to the industry. Let's talk. She didn't reply. She forwarded the email to the federal registrar and blind copied the whistleblower contact. Then she stood and exhaled. That evening, her goddaughter Tasha walked into her apartment, holding 2 takeout bags. Tonight we eat comfort food. You look like you fought Congress. Marcia gave a half smile. Close. They sat on the couch, shoes off, takeout open. Between bites of dumplings, Tasha asked, do you ever get tired of being the strong one? Marcia didn't answer at first, then softly, not tired, but I do get disappointed. By people? No. By how quickly truth gets sold when ambition walks in with a price tag. Tasha looked at her like only someone who's seen your soul does. So what keeps you going? Marcia's reply was simple. The quiet kids in the back of the room, the ones watching everything. I'm building for them. The next day, the news finally broke. Not from her. From a leak inside the SEC. The headline hit like a thunderclap. Claiborne Ethics System to anchor new federal ethics protocol. Sabotage probe underway. The markets trembled. 2 CEOs stepped down. A third issued a public apology and requested a full federal audit, voluntarily. Not because they were brave, because they were scared. At 4:17 p.m., her office line rang. It was Senator Corbin, head of the Senate Oversight Committee. Marcia, he said, we'd like you to testify, publicly. She didn't flinch. When? In 3 weeks. On record, you'll be setting precedent. I'm not interested in optics, she said. He chuckled. Exactly why we're calling. That evening, she walked alone to the Claiborne Foundation building. She took the elevator to the rooftop. The city lights shimmered like a constellation of moving decisions. She didn't smile, but she closed her eyes, and finally, felt still. Because this wasn't just a win. It was a restructuring of power. The Senate Oversight Committee chamber was colder than it looked on TV. Not temperature-wise, but cold in the way that power sometimes is. Quiet, still, and heavy with judgment. Marcia Claiborne sat at the witness table, alone. No legal team, no entourage, no PR flack whispering lines behind her. Just a glass of water, a binder of facts, and an unwavering stare. The room was full. Senators, reporters, lobbyists, ethics watchdogs, CEOs watching from private feeds. Everyone expected a performance, but Marcia didn't show up to perform. She showed up to tell the truth, without theater. Senator Corbin opened the session. Ms. Claiborne, thank you for being here. You've been called to provide testimony regarding the recent ethics breach involving the Claiborne Index and several major investment firms, including Bexton Capital and Devermore Partners. You may begin with an opening statement. Marcia didn't shuffle papers. She didn't even glance at notes. She leaned in slightly and spoke, measured, clear, and unbothered. Thank you, Chairman. I'm not here to accuse individuals. I'm here to explain a system and how some chose to corrupt it when it didn't serve their shortcuts. Silence. She continued. What we built at Claiborne wasn't meant to punish. It was meant to warn. It was designed so every firm, every fund, and every founder could ask one question before launching a product, a fund, or a merger. Will this pass the mirror test? Meaning, can I look myself in the mirror and say this serves more than my profit? A few pens stopped moving. She looked straight at the senators. But what we learned, and what brings me here today, is that for some, that mirror cracked the moment it reflected consequence. Senator Blanchard, older and always suspicious of tech ethics, interjected. Ms. Claiborne, are you implying that these firms committed criminal fraud using your system? Marcia met his gaze. I'm stating for the record that they manipulated internal audits, paid for pre-certified verdicts, and targeted junior analysts within our team to alter rejection language, all in violation of our federal integrity protocols. Whether that is criminal, I'll leave to the DOJ. The room tightened. Even Corbin raised his eyebrows. She went on. The problem isn't just corruption. The problem is how easy it is to cloak corruption in professionalism. These people didn't forge signatures. They forged trust. The next 90 minutes were a mix of sharp questions and even sharper restraint. Senator Klein pressed her on Claiborne's internal vulnerabilities. Did you fail to protect your people from being bought? Marcia nodded. Yes, that's on me. But I'd ask you, what protection do you offer whistleblowers who hand you the truth and get blackballed for it? No one answered. Senator Reyes, a quiet voice with the gravitas of someone who listens more than she speaks, leaned forward. Ms. Claiborne, what do you believe happens next? Marcia paused. It wasn't a rhetorical pause. She was thinking carefully. If we do nothing, firms will continue to greenwash their way into public favor. Billionaires will buy ethics like they buy beachfronts. And your grandchildren will inherit markets full of shiny compliance and rotten intent. She took a breath. But if we act, not with rage, but with resolve, we can make ethics more than a marketing word. We can make it a condition of access. The phrase condition of access landed like a gavel. Reporters scribbled it down instantly. On social media, #condition of access started trending within minutes. But Marcia didn't care. She wasn't building a brand. She was redefining a boundary. The final question came from Senator Corbin himself. Ms. Claiborne, what do you propose this committee do? She leaned in. Her voice softened. Not weaker, just closer. Make ethics non-optional. Require all federal-facing firms to undergo ethics clearance through independent bodies, not in-house audits. Make whistleblower protection mandatory, not discretionary. And create an independent oversight board with enforcement teeth, not ceremonial titles. The truth doesn't need fanfare, it needs consequences. The room was still for a full beat. Then, "Thank you, Ms. Claiborne. That concludes our session." She stood. No applause, no handshake line. But as she walked out, 4 different aides from rival senators handed her cards. Each whispered the same thing: "We need to talk." Outside, the crowd of press waited. Cameras, flashes, microphones shoved forward. "Ms. Claiborne, do you feel vindicated?" She didn't stop walking, but she said one thing as she passed. "It's not about vindication. It's about making sure the next girl doesn't need to fight this hard." That evening, back in her office, Jerome brought her a short report. The CEOs of Devermore and Archon both announced full ethics audits, voluntarily. "Fear or principle?" she asked. "Mostly fear." She half smiled. "Fear works too, for now." But then came the moment she didn't expect. A handwritten letter, delivered by courier, from Ethan, the analyst who had betrayed her months before. Inside, a single page. "Marcia, I watched your testimony today. You could have dragged me into that chamber. You didn't. I was a coward. You gave me the chance to face it instead of hide. I've since joined a pro bono ethics research group. I'm not writing for redemption, just thanks. E." She read it twice, then tucked it in a drawer labeled private, because some victories weren't public. They were quiet wins for dignity. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine, walked barefoot onto her balcony, and looked out at the city. The world hadn't changed overnight, but its temperature had shifted, and she had reset the room, not with yelling, not with scandal, but with clarity and calm and consequence. 6 weeks had passed since the Senate hearing, and not a single press conference from Marcia Claiborne. No interviews, no op-eds, no podcast appearances, just action. Quiet, strategic, irreversible action. The Claiborne Ethics Enforcement Council, now nicknamed the CEEC, was operational in record time. 10 investigators, 7 industry analysts, 3 federal liaisons, all reporting to one woman who never asked for power, but wielded it with surgical clarity. Marcia didn't chair it. She structured it, then stepped back. Because legacy, to her, wasn't about attention. It was about systems that don't need her name to function. In New York, boardrooms began replacing mission statements with compliance roadmaps. Investment firms, the same ones that once mocked ESG standards, now scrambled to meet baseline integrity scores. And behind closed doors, a memo leaked. "If you want federal money, you better pass Claiborne." Not a person, a protocol. One Monday morning, Tasha, her goddaughter, walked into Marcia's office holding a printed email. "Guess who just resigned?" Marcia looked up. "Lawrence?" Tasha nodded. "Public statement says he's stepping down to explore philanthropic priorities." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "Did he mention the SEC probe in his farewell letter?" Tasha smirked. "Funny, not a word. They didn't toast, they didn't celebrate. Because consequences aren't victories, they're hygiene." That afternoon, Marcia received a package. No return address. Inside, a framed photograph of her mother, taken in 1967, marching in Selma. The note said, "She walked so you could build. Thank you for not just building a seat at the table, but remaking the room." No signature, but the handwriting was familiar. Senator Reyes. The next day, Marcia finally allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. She walked alone into the Claiborne Foundation's new research wing. On the wall, a bronze plaque. It didn't have her name. It had 12 words: "Ethics is not restraint, it's responsibility, and it starts with courage." Underneath, a small digital screen pulsed with real-time ethics compliance scores across 147 firms. Updated every 3 hours. Public, unfiltered, permanent. Later that evening, she attended a private industry summit in San Francisco. She wasn't on the speaker list. She sat in the second row. At one point, the moderator asked a panel of CEOs, "Do you think the Claiborne standards go too far?" One CEO laughed nervously. Before he could answer, a younger black woman on the panel, early 30s, crisp white suit, leaned forward and said, Too far for who? If your business model collapses under the weight of basic integrity, maybe that's not Claiborne's fault. Maybe that's a mirror you're scared to look into. The room froze. Marcia didn't say a word. But in that moment, she knew. The work didn't just land. It multiplied. That night, as her flight ascended above the bay, Marcia looked out the window, past the clouds, toward nothing in particular. Tasha leaned her head on her shoulder and whispered, "You know what the most powerful part of all this is?" Marcia turned. "What?" Tasha smiled. "They tried to humiliate you in a restaurant, and now entire industries are rewriting policy, just to keep up with your silence." Marcia said nothing, just looked ahead, calm. Back in New York, 6 days later, the SEC quietly dropped 2 enforcement memos into public record. Permanent ethics compliance disclosure requirement for all public firms. Claiborne Index listed as a Tier 1 benchmark for pre-clearance eligibility. No fanfare, just law. By month's end, Forbes ran a feature titled, "The Most Powerful Voice in Finance," and she never raised it. Marcia didn't read it, but Tasha clipped the cover, framed it, and tucked it behind the bookshelf in Marcia's private study. Not for guests, for moments. Then came the final full-circle moment. She was invited to speak, not at Davos, not at Harvard, but at Brixton High School, where she grew up. She stood on that same stage where she once debated policy at 16. Now 50, she looked out at a sea of brown and black faces, some with braids, some with books, some with tired eyes full of hidden brilliance. And she said, "They will underestimate you. They will try to embarrass you, define you, shrink you. But remember this, power isn't volume, it's alignment. Align your actions with your values, and the world will eventually have no choice but to align with you." Thunderous applause. But she didn't smile for the claps. She smiled for the future already sitting in front of her. As she walked off stage, a 14-year-old girl ran up, eyes wide, voice shaking. "Ms. Claiborne, do you think someone like me could ever build something like you did?" Marcia knelt down, leveled her gaze, and said softly, "Sweetheart, I built this so you wouldn't have to ask that question again." If you were in Marcia's shoes, would you have stayed silent or spoken out? And more importantly, do you think dignity still has power in today's world? Let us know in the comments below, and tell us where you're watching from. We read every story, every city, every voice, because this isn't just a story, it's a conversation.